Well, good morning. I am excited to bring a message to you today. I really enjoyed this series on building a non-anxious life. Pastor Andre has done such a great job over the last 5 weeks helping us build a path and finding our way to this thing called a non-anxious life. You know, he's talked about choosing reality by eliminating counterfeit ideas that we believe about anxiety, and then being connected by being known and loved by those around us. He showed us how to experience freedom and God's wisdom and to be mindful of his grace. And then last week, he talked about how to combat fear when things are out of our control. Well, today, I'm going to wrap up this series, and I'm going to be talking about healing, both physically and mentally. So take some notes today. You can take notes in the church app or on a journal, but take some notes on this final message today on building a non-anxious life. So how many of you like theme parks and roller coasters? I'm glad we have a few daredevils out there. So I am from the Rock Hill, Fort Mill area of the state, and so Carowinds was in my backyard growing up. Almost every year, when I was young, my parents would take us to the park and let us ride all of the rides in the kiddie land, so like the less adventurous rides. Back then, it was called Hanna-Barbera Land. This was long before there was water park or it was owned by Paramount. But Hanna-Barbera Land, all of the rides would coincide with names of cartoons. So like the Jetsons, the Flintstones, Yogi Bear, Scooby-Doo. So if you're a child of the 80s and 90s, you recognize all of those cartoons. So my parents would take us every year to the park, and it was always one of the highlights of our summer. Now, my parents love roller coasters. So much so, they would take us to the park in the morning, and then in the afternoon, like late afternoon, they would hire a babysitter, which they rarely did. And they would go back to the park, and they would close out the park riding rides. And I was terrified of roller coasters. But in Hanna-Barbera Land, they had a kiddie roller coaster called Scooby-Doo. You can see it up here. And I was about 6 or 7, and my mom had convinced me, Casey, you should go on this ride. It's like more your speed. You're going to love it. Okay, I was definitely scared of the big coasters, but, I could try a kid's one. Well, I get on this ride. I sit next to my cousin. He was about the same age as me. And we're on there. We're riding up to the first hill, and from that first drop, my stomach was in my throat, and I was utterly terrified. It scared the daylights out of me. I got off that ride, and I said, I never want to ride anything like that ever again. My mom actually kind of felt bad about it, but I was just so terrified, and I had all of these symptoms. My heart was racing, and I was sweating, and I was just so nervous. Well, fast forward about 4 years, and I'm back at Carowinds again with my parents. I'm riding some bigger rides, so like out of the kiddie park some, riding like, Kaleidoscope and the Rip-Roaring Rapids, if you've ever been. And but no coasters. Every time I would think about it, I would get nervous. But my dad, who loves roller coasters, always trying to get us kids to ride the big coasters. So he tells me this particular year, so I was about 10 or 11, and I was tall enough, Casey, if you ride the Vortex with me, I will give you $100. Now, this was back in the early 1990s, so $100 is a lot of money. So I'm like, okay, hesitantly, okay, I'll do it. So now the Vortex, is a picture of it, was the newest ride at Carowinds that year, and it's a standing roller coaster. You don't sit, you stand the whole time. And of course, it has a big drop, and it goes upside down, and all the things that a big coaster has. So we go and we stand in line. It's a very long line. It's also the last line of the day, because after this line is completed, they're going to be closing the park. So we get all the way up there. It's my turn. My heart is racing. I'm sweating all over. I'm so nervous. I feel like I'm going to throw up. I want that money so bad. But at the end of the day, quite literally, I chickened out and I couldn't do it. And I walked down my walk of shame all the way down the stairs, and my dad laughed at me all the way down. On the way home, he's like, I was a little nervous you were going to go through with that, and I was going to have to come up with $100 to give you. Now, I wouldn't exactly say that I experienced childhood trauma over roller coasters. However, my body's response to riding a roller coaster for the first time was cemented in my brain, and all of those same feelings, even years later, triggered when I even thought about riding another one. Our bodies were made to respond to something terrifying with these release of hormones that give us this fight or flight or freeze reactions. Our brain is just wired to remember these events and protect us from future threats. It's actually a good thing. I like how the author of Building a Non-Anxious Life puts it. He says, our bodies put a GPS pin in these moments and devise defensive and evasive maneuvers in an attempt to never be hurt by the same things again. My body had put a GPS pin in that memory of me riding Scooby-Doo, and when I was in line to ride the Vortex with my dad, it was producing all of the anxiety and the physical symptoms to make me do what I ultimately did, which was escape the experience of riding another roller coaster. But did you know that a lot of our anxiety can be attributed to past trauma and terrifying events? Every one of us has experienced trauma in our life. With each trauma experience, our body puts another GPS pin in that moment, and our bodies signal alarms like nervousness and a knot in your stomach, headaches, sweating, heart racing, all signaling run, escape, be safe. Those alarms, they go off again and again whenever we experience something that our body or our mind perceive as a threat, based on those past traumas and events. Now, when I say trauma, what is it that you think of? Roller coasters might be traumatizing for a 6-year-old, but it's much more sobering traumas that truly affect our lives. How about 9/11? Most of us were alive on that terrible day, and most of us can remember exactly where we were as we were watching those events unfold live on TV. Does your mind take you back to a particular moment when you think about trauma in your life? Maybe it was a car crash, or getting fired or laid off and not knowing what you're going to do next. Getting a cancer diagnosis, either you or someone you love. Maybe it was sexual trauma, physical abuse, being assaulted, discovering your spouse has been unfaithful, or the sudden death of someone that you love. These are all undeniably life-changing and life-altering events that will undoubtedly cause anxiety and fear and grief. All of these are referred to as acute traumas. But there are other traumas that affect our lives as well that might not be as obvious, that also our bodies put GPS pins in them, and we remember them, and our bodies still respond to them. How about those of us who are consistently exposed to other people's pain, such as teachers, police officers, healthcare workers, first responders, pastors, social workers, lawyers? Many of these people are present on someone's worst day, and they have a front row seat to their pain, and they end up burdening themselves with that same pain. Other traumas are things like neglect, not being fed or clothed, being homeless, or not being loved as a child. Another type is cumulative type traumas, where you're being picked on as a kid over and over and over again, or you're told repeatedly that you're not good enough and you don't measure up. All of these traumas have something in common. All of them happen to us, and they are out of our control. Just like Pastor Andre talked about last week, we didn't choose any of these things. They just happened, and we have no control over it. But nonetheless, they affect our lives, and they ultimately have lasting effects on our mental state if we don't deal with it. We carry around our trauma and our with our pre-programmed physical responses, and we live in a state of expecting the bottom to drop out at any minute. So what happens when we endure these traumas and it affects our bodies in such a way that the physical symptoms of anxiety and worry get triggered over and over? And yet we really want to have a peaceful, non-anxious life. It seems our bodies are working so hard to protect us from bad things happening that we don't even get a moment's peace. So how do we resolve this conflict of our bodies constantly signaling fire, run, and our minds desiring peace? I'd like to walk with you through a story in the Bible of trauma, devotion, and faithfulness to help us find some answers to this very question. So turn with me, if you will, to the book of Daniel. Daniel's in the Old Testament. And we're going to be in chapter 1. But before I read, let me give you some context and kind of set the scene as what's going on here in the first chapter of Daniel. So it's the summer of 605 BC. Daniel is about 15 years old, and he's in that sweet spot of being a teenager. You know, where he's old enough to have some freedoms. Maybe he's old enough to, go to Carowinds with his friends and ride some rides. But he's still young enough that he doesn't have too many responsibilities. He's living his best life with his friends in the summer of 605. Daniel was born into nobility. He was actually a prince of Judah. He's smart. He's good looking. Daniel is what we would call today a great kid. He's the kind of kid that you'd want to hang out with or you'd want to date your daughter. But he's super humble. He's kind of the Tim Tebow of his generation, if you will. So there's a day in the summer of 605 when Daniel and his friends are living their best life when everything changes. What happened this day would change the course of history. It would be their last day in Jerusalem and their last time sleeping in their bed, their last time with their families. The book of Daniel is an autobiography, and so Daniel's telling his own story, and he starts it this way. So we're going to start in Daniel 1, chapter 1. It'll be on the screen here too. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Let me pause here. Daniel and his friends see this enormous army surround their city, and they knew what that meant because it had meant the same thing for every other empire up until this point. The mighty Babylonian Empire enters Jerusalem, and they besiege it. They overtake it. Now, Babylon is a secular kingdom, and you might be asking yourself, why is God allowing this pagan, idol-worshiping kingdom to come in and take over his people? Jerusalem, where the temple is. What's happened? What's led up to this point? Well, the people of Judah, who are God's chosen people, have turned their backs on God once again. And God is allowing them to be taken into exile to Babylon as punishment. Daniel and his friends at this point were essentially kidnapped. They were taken 500 miles away to a foreign city where they didn't even speak the language. His home, his family, his security. He must have felt like he lost everything that day and his life is spinning out of control. All of this happened to Daniel, and he's just a survivor. Daniel had to have experienced a lot of the same physical and emotional responses to trauma as we still do today. Daniel doesn't explicitly express this in the text, but I'm sure he experienced anxiety, probably depression, a tremendous amount of grief and fear. Daniel was a victim, but he didn't live his life that way. Let's continue on in Daniel, verse 4. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well versed in every branch of learning and are gifted with knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years. Then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. Azariah was called Abednego. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Verse 8 says, but Daniel was determined. Other translations say he resolved or he decided to live his life in a way that still brought glory to God despite his circumstances. Daniel found himself living in a pagan culture that was foreign to him in every way. His freedom was taken. Even his own name was taken away. And then he was put into a training program to intentionally conform him and assimilate him into the Babylonian ways. This was essentially to strip away everything from them that they had known. All of this caused Daniel concern. He was concerned about what he was consuming of the Babylonian culture. Remember, in the midst of processing this loss and grief and anxiety, and his body's telling him to run away and find safety, he wants to keep whatever he has left of home and who he believes God still to be. Everything he did was controlled by the king. So Daniel had to have put a lot of thought into what he did next. He was one of the brightest and best that Jerusalem had to offer, after all. As we read, Daniel was given a new name. He was probably given new clothes. He was made to learn a new language and a new culture. So what could he take control of? Rebelling against the clothes would be too obvious. Rebelling against the instruction would be counterproductive. But perhaps he could take control of his diet. He then chooses what he will put into his body, what he will consume. Daniel chooses to honor God's laws and not defile himself by requesting to eat food that is not sacrificed to idols and prepared in a way that is contrary to God's law. What we put into our bodies and how we treat our bodies, it affects our minds and the way that we process trauma. The passage goes on to say that the food he happens to choose is vegetables and water. And the choice of food would honor God's law, but this food also won't affect his mind or his ability to think and process the trauma that he just lived through. If you keep reading in chapter 1, God blesses this choice by making his appearance noticeably better than everybody else's after just 10 days. This has to be a miracle, right? Because how many of us try a diet for 10 days and we get on that scale, and we look in the mirror, and there is no change, let alone a noticeable change for everybody else to see. God honors his decision and his choice. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should just eat vegetables and drink water whenever we're experiencing trauma or anxiety. The Bible also endorses eating meat and bread and fruit and all other kinds of food in various parts of the Bible. And if you know me, I have no doubt that if Dr. Pepper existed back in the Old Testament times, that would have been endorsed somewhere as well. But the point is not necessarily what Daniel ate. Rather, he is choosing to protect his body and his mind and honor God at the same time. Daniel is concerned about what he's consuming of the Babylonian culture, and he doesn't want to take in any more of Babylon than he has to at this point. But I wonder, what parts of our culture are we consuming that is contributing to our anxieties? What are we consuming both physically and mentally from our culture that is toxic and unhealthy? We know that eating junk food and processed food and high-fat foods are unhealthy, and they increase inflammation in our bodies. Also, high levels of caffeine cause increased heart rate and can actually cause anxiety and headaches. But how much coffee do we drink just to get through the day? Starbucks alone sells 4 million cups of coffee a day. That's enough to fill 4 Olympic swimming pools per day. We struggle with anxiety and worry, and yet we fill our cups every day with something that is just worsening it. Beyond food, what else are our minds consuming that's contributing to anxiety? I've read, as a provider, countless studies that say the more time that teenagers spend on social media, the more likely they are to experience anxiety and to go on to develop anxiety disorders. Statistics about information overload and increasing anxieties, they don't surprise us. And yet we continue to consume and bury our minds in our devices that are producing more and more anxieties and worries. We see people's highlight reels on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, and we think, my life just doesn't measure up. Keeping up with the Joneses used to be, we see the neighbor's new car, or we see their new clothes at the picnic. But no more. We have an inside look to their life. We see all of their vacation pictures. We see what they spend their money on. We have this constant flow of information that keeps us feeling like we don't have it as good as them, and we're not measuring up, and it creates anxiety within us. We watch the news incessantly, following political trends and the state of the world, our economy and inflation. The news rarely has anything good to say, doesn't it? It keeps people in a constant state of what's next. It's no wonder anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness and affect 40 million Americans. That's 20% of the population. 1 in 5. Instead of making choices that improve our health, our bodies, and our minds, we fall into this trap of consuming things in our culture that frankly perpetuate and exacerbate our states of anxiety. We lay in bed at night with racing thoughts, replaying our day, playing the what-if game, or worrying about tomorrow. Our anxieties cause us to walk around during the day feeling like I'm so irritable and everything's getting on my last nerve. Or we walk around so overwhelmed that one more thing might just make us crack. Our bodies can certainly trigger anxiety based on past events and trauma, but we can also choose what to put in our bodies and our minds and choose what we will consume and what we won't consume that will either help us or hinder us in our path to healing. So how can we be more like Daniel? How can we choose health and healing to help us overcome and have that non-anxious life that we all want so badly? Well, I have some ways that will help us deal with just that. The first thing I would say is we need to recognize that we have agency. We all have agency. And what does that mean? The dictionary defines agency as the capacity, condition, or state of acting or of exerting power. Essentially, it is the power to choose. To choose things that are on the path to healing, and to choose to walk away from things that are causing or exacerbating our anxieties. Daniel 1:8 says, Daniel was determined, or Daniel resolved. Despite having everything taken away from him, Daniel recognized that he still had a choice. He took small steps, one at a time, but each choice put him on the path to healing, and God was with him with every choice he made. The choices that Daniel made in his life were not easy. Choosing health and healing is hard, and it can often feel like we take one step forward and 3 steps backwards. Choices like choosing to move out of that toxic or sinful living situation even though it might cause financial hardship. Choosing to grieve the life that you wanted but haven't had up until now, and accepting the life that you have. Choosing to see a counselor to help you work through that childhood trauma that you experienced. We can choose to forgive, whether it be someone that has harmed you or forgiving yourself. Regardless of what those choices look like for you, choosing healing is about facing your anxiety and trauma head on. But we don't have to face them alone. God promises to be with us with each step, just like he was with Daniel. So first, we can recognize that we have agency and we have the power to choose. The next thing we can do is talk. The process of talking about and talking through our traumas is a known and established way to heal from our past traumas. Daniel had his friends with him on this journey from Jerusalem to Babylon. It was about 500 miles, and I doubt they had any other form of transportation than their own 2 feet. So there was a lot of time, about 3 or 4 months that they were traveling. In that time, I would imagine they would have a lot of time to talk, express their emotions, process through what happened to them, grieve their losses, and come to a place of acceptance. Trauma at its core is loss. In order to work through loss, we have to go through the stages of grief. Sometimes not in order, sometimes multiple times. But talking through your trauma with either a therapist or a trusted friend will help you walk through those stages. Help you realize that you are safe. You are not defined by that moment or that trauma that happened to you. And come to a place of acceptance where your body is not constantly reacting and sending anxiety signals telling you you're not safe. So we can recognize we have agency. We can talk. The next thing we can do is walk. Daniel did a lot of walking and physical exertion on his trip from Jerusalem to Babylon. And exercise, it has a lot of benefits. It changes the brain's chemistry. It can help you regulate and control your emotions and distance yourself from that fight or flight response that anxiety gives us. Also, when we are anxious and uptight, our muscles tighten, and exercise actually releases muscle tension. I would argue that exercise and moving our bodies daily is one of the top 2 things that you can do to regulate and control the physical symptoms of anxiety. There was a particular time in my life that I battled with anxiety from past trauma. I had a lot of personal stressors at the time. I had a lot of imagined worries that just plagued my mind, and it just caused almost crippling anxiety at times. And I had this friend who was running half marathons, and she kept at me to start running. And I thought, there is no way I can walk, let alone run 13 miles in one sitting. But she convinced me, much like my mom and dad did with roller coasters, and I started running. I discovered something that I had only read about. I discovered that I had more energy, I slept better, I worried less, and I found if I was having a really anxious day, a good hard run would really alleviate all of my physical symptoms of anxiety that day. Symptoms like headache, nausea, fatigue, just wanting to withdraw, brain fog, all of those physical symptoms that we experience when we're overwhelmed with anxiety. Exercise has tremendous benefits to help you overcome. I found that my mind was clear. I could see circumstances for what they were. Circumstances didn't change. They still weren't easy. But it gave me a way to see them in a refreshing and a clearer way that wasn't this overwhelming mountain that was just swallowing me up. So we can recognize agency. We can talk. We can walk. How about sleep? We were made to sleep and recharge our bodies and our minds. Sleep is a way for our bodies and our minds to heal. Daniel, he followed all of God's laws, which would have included a Sabbath, a day of rest. God created rest and sleep It was his idea. He even demonstrated it by example by when he created the world, he rested on the seventh day. And he even put it into his law, the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. See, God knows that our brain is an organ, just like the heart, the liver, the kidneys. It needs similar things to that those organs need, like food and water and oxygen. But the other thing that it needs that is different is sleep. Lack of sleep is directly correlated with anxiety. How do you feel when you've been up for 24 hours straight? We've all done it, right? And we feel terrible. Our bodies and our minds start exhibiting the signs of irritability and anxiety from just missing one night's sleep. And the more sleep you miss, the worse it gets. After 2 or 3 nights without sleep, you start having delusions, psychosis, cognitive impairment, visual changes. The lack of sleep negatively affects your minds and your ability to just function. You know, I have patients that come in and say to me, I'm so tired and I have no energy and I can't focus. Well, one of my first questions is, are you sleeping? How much are you sleeping? You know, when we choose not to sleep, we miss out on the sleep that our brain needs. When we choose to go to bed at midnight and wake up at 5 a.m., or we stay up late watching that show, or we have other habits that prevent us from getting a full night's sleep. The bottom line is our brains need sleep. Sleep is as vital to our health as exercise and food. But we treat it as something we can skimp on, and somehow we're just more heroic for doing so. Without proper rest, our brains don't function properly, and it just perpetuates our anxieties, prevents us from healing from trauma, and can have dire long-term consequences. But when we sleep and we rest as God designed us to, it helps our minds feel refreshed. Our brains function properly, and they aren't sending anxiety signals inappropriately. It is when our brains are functioning properly that we can start working through trauma and begin healing. The last thing I want to talk about is gratefulness. And this one is interesting, a bit scientific, but try and follow me. God designed our brains in such a way that we cannot experience gratitude and anxiety and fear at the same time. When we are feeling thankful and grateful, the fear and anxiety pathway, if you will, in our brain is cut off. Our brain only has 2 modes, and we can only operate in one mode at a time. I won't bore you with their names, but the one is fight or flight. So that anxiety, that, when we get that fear, that's one mode. The other mode is rest and digest. And gratefulness falls into the rest and digest mode. When we are grateful, it quite literally cuts off the pathway to anxiety, and it is physically impossible to experience gratefulness and anxiety at the same time. Daniel had another crisis come his way when the king had a dream that he didn't understand, and so he threatened to kill all of the wise men, including Daniel and his friends, if someone did not only interpret the dream, but also tell him the dream that he had. Daniel goes to God in prayer and asks God to reveal the dream to him and its meaning. God indeed reveals both the dream and the interpretation to Daniel, but before he goes to the king, Daniel prays this prayer of gratefulness and thankfulness to God. Let me read it to you this morning. It's in Daniel 2. He says, "Praise the name of God forever and ever, for he has all wisdom and power. He controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the scholars. He reveals deep and mysterious things. He knows what lies hidden in the darkness, though he is surrounded by light. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors, for you have given me wisdom and strength. You have told me what we asked of you and revealed to us what the king demanded." The feelings of gratefulness and thankfulness that Daniel experienced would have cut off the pathway to anxiety in Daniel's body. Practicing gratefulness can actually lower your anxiety and give us peace. There's another verse that speaks directly to this in Philippians 4. It says, "Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank Him for all He has done. Then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. His peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ Jesus." When we pray and we tell God what we need and we cry out to Him and we tell Him all the things that we are anxious about, and then we thank Him, we're left with feelings of gratitude, and that pathway to anxiety is physically cut off when we are thankful. And it allows the Holy Spirit to give us God's peace, which is a long-lasting peace. Daniel's faith and gratitude was also evident to those around him. Daniel's faced with crisis over and over in his life. I encourage you to go read the book of Daniel. It's one of my favorites. And back when he was 15, he resolved to follow God no matter what. Fast forward 66 years, and he's 81 years old. Daniel has led his life in such a way that has been honoring to God and maintained his faith through many regime changes, many crises, and now he finds himself being promoted and appointed to one of the highest positions over the now Persian Empire. He's developed a relationship and a rapport with the now King Darius. But once again, Daniel's faced with another crisis. This relationship that he has with King Darius and this promotion, it creates jealousy within some of the other officials. And they plot to get rid of Daniel. They try to discredit him by attacking his character. But they can't find anything. Daniel 6 says that Daniel was always responsible, faithful, and completely trustworthy. So they try another route. Instead of attacking Daniel's character, they attack his faith. They devise a plan to make it illegal to worship anybody or anything else other than the king for 30 days. And then they convince the king to sign this law, and once it's signed, it cannot be revoked. The king signs it. Once Daniel hears about the law, what do you think he does? Think he runs away, goes and hides? Nope. He goes back to his house, just like he always does. He opens the window towards Jerusalem, and he prays, and he thanks God. Of course, the officials knew that Daniel would be praying at this time, so he was arrested. King Darius was so distraught, and he tries to come up with some way to save Daniel, but he just can't. And so he has to put Daniel into this den of hungry lions. Even though Darius has not known Daniel that long, he knows that Daniel's faith, and the last thing he says to him, he says before closing and sealing up him in the lion's den is, "May your God, who you serve so faithfully, rescue you." Again, the king is so distraught over what has happened. He fasts. He doesn't want any entertainment that night. He's up all night. I can only imagine he's just pacing. And the next morning, it was the king that rushes out to check on Daniel. He doesn't send anybody. The king goes himself. And when I picture this scene, I like to picture this picture of Daniel standing in the lion's den. And the king runs out, and he calls out to Daniel and says, "Daniel, did your God save you?" And Daniel is standing there casually at peace, his back towards the lions. And he answers him and says, "I'm here. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions." People around Daniel knew his faith. Even the king. Even he was hoping that Daniel's God was real and that he could be saved. And of course, God does save Daniel. King Darius is overjoyed, and he sends out a decree across the entire empire proclaiming that the God of Daniel is the one true living God. Our faithfulness and our consistent responses to trauma and crisis has an effect on not only on your lives and how we deal and process trauma, but also has an effect on those around us. The effective healing from trauma is twofold. When we trust in God and make choices in our life that are guided by the Holy Spirit to a place of healing and peace, our own lives are restored. And what a miracle that is. But also, others get to see us go through this crisis and trauma. It creates opportunity for people to see into our lives and to see that even in the midst of trauma, that God is real and He can be trusted. God gives us healing and peace, and it's not just for us. It is also for those around us to see God work and to come to realize what King Darius ultimately did, which is that we serve the one true God, and He is faithful to be with us, to rescue us, and to heal us from the pain that life brings us so that they too can come to know them for themselves. To Christ alone be the glory. Will you pray? Will you pray with me this morning and stand?